We are Sex Bomb, and we're here to watch Scott Pilgrim kick your teeth in. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm Chris Spivey.
And I'm Eddie Webb.
And today we're here to talk about Edgar Wright's greatest directorial feat up to the year 2010. Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Welcome back, listeners. We've had our Cornetto run, but we wanted to top it off with a bonus feature that I think influenced at least one of the movies, Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Indeed. Have you read any of the comics for Scott Pilgrim?
The movie was the first time I'd ever even heard about Scott Pilgrim, and it inspired me to pick up one or two of the books, and I read them. And they weren't really my thing, but they were, the ones I read were okay. I think it was 6 books overall.
Yes. I've read the whole series, mainly because I got them for cheap online. But I bring them up because the initial comic was so the artist and writer, same person, very much approached them as he read some manga in the early 2000s, liked the style, and kind of just wanted to use the style. But what kind of result from that is that a lot of people, particularly Japanese manga writers, have since gone on to read Scott Pilgrim because it's been imported to Japan, and found that it was a very interesting juxtaposition of the kind of shonen style manga and extremely pedestrian, low stakes 20-year-olds living in Canada. And so it was always started off as kind of a juxtaposition of comic book heightened action with just emotional beats. And so going into the movie, it seemed like Wright wanted to kind of just layer more of those juxtapositions on top of it, which, given what we've seen from Wright, makes him a fantastic director to try to do that with.
Mm-hmm. What was fascinating, though, is that after the first book published, his publisher immediately started reaching out to people to try to turn it into a movie.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I would love to have a publisher that would do that. So I need to talk to myself, because I'm my own publisher, to see if I can find people that would go and publish my stuff. But first book, they reached out to people to have making a movie. And I think I can't remember who it was, but they instantly said, you know what, that's a great idea. And that's when they started going around, and that's when they reached out to Wright. And I think Wright was finishing up the Shaun of the Dead tour when he first read the first one of it, and was immediately on board. Like, this movie was in some form of production from equivalently 2004/5 all the way up to when it released in 2010. Like, they had a couple years they wrote the script. Wright postponed his Ant-Man stuff by a year or two, I think, to work on this. I think that may have bit him in the ass in the end. But this was more important for him personally to do.
If I remember correctly, also the last book actually wasn't written as they started going into the movie. So I think the last book and the ending of the movie were kind of written roughly simultaneously.
Yeah, because I think Brian Lee O'Malley, is that the writer?
Thank you. I can think of his name.
He sort of worked very closely with Wright and whoever the writer was, providing them ideas. I want to say, like you were saying, like the last book or the 5th or 6th book wasn't completely written. And so stuff from the film itself influenced the ending of like the book, because he liked certain scenes from it. He put them directly in the book, which we'll touch on those when we get there. So there was a lot of back and forth. One of the things that I found fascinating, because I read a couple of interview beats, is that one of the interviews, he originally didn't want to make into a movie because he figured that Hollywood would cast someone that he hates, but at the same time was a starving artist and said, you know what, at the end of the day, I don't care. I just want the money.
Right.
A very honest, starving artist.
And as far as I know, he's not pulled an Alan Moore. He's been actually pretty supportive of all the adaptations of Scott Pilgrim.
Oh, yeah, but I would say probably a lot of that goes to Wright, though, because they kept him as an integral part of the process from everything I saw. He wasn't in the casting, but they sent him people's audition tapes,
Mm-hmm.
and he agreed with most of those. Wright had seen Michael Cera in Arrested Development and instantly wanted him for the role of Scott.
Okay.
And he'd seen Mary Elizabeth Winstead in Death Proof and wanted her for Ramona. So those were his first two choices for the roles, and he got them both.
And I do know that the crew of this have been actually extremely tight since this, because Netflix last year did Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which is not an adaptation, but it's an animated reimagining of Scott Pilgrim because it goes in very different directions. But all but two of the characters got new voice actors, or sorry, all but two of the characters were portrayed by the same people who portrayed them in the movie, and the only people who were portrayed differently were the two twins because they had no speaking parts in the original movie, and they were given an actual speaking part in the animated series.
That's cool.
So yeah, Chris Evans was doing. Chris was this. All the people that are now big stars were doing this anime manga, this anime like a year ago.
I still got to say though, for Chris Evans, I love Captain America, but other than Marvel, what's a really good Chris Evans film?
Well, that's something I've been thinking about since we talked about Knives Out. Is that I've been since watching or rewatching in this case Chris Evans movies before Captain America, and of course we talked about Knives Out, and then he had another movie recently which is bad. And except for Captain America, Chris Evans' role is basically charismatic, attractive jerk.
Yeah. Because even in the movie that I think that he was good in that I liked, I think it was called Pushers. It was like a psychic, where he was a psychic.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was a movie about like people with mental powers.
Mm-hmm.
Which was before Cap, I still want to say it wasn't a great movie, but it was okay, and he was a charismatic jerk.
Right. He was in Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four movies. Which his best Johnny Storm role was the cameo he did in Wolverine and Deadpool.
Spoilers, Eddie. What if people haven't seen that movie yet?
That's not my fault. Ketchup scrub.
If anything, and I think there are a lot of Brie Larson haters, which I don't understand. But she was I think she was an Emmy Award-winning actress. So that is like a huge kudos in that she came back to do voice acting. Although I don't know what roles she's had other than her TV series that was on Apple TV. That was pretty good. It's like something of physics.
And even I am blanking on her name. Audrey.
Audrey Plaza.
Yeah. She was big right before this in Parks and Rec.
No. I think this was before Parks and Rec for her.
Was it really?
Yeah, I want to say this was like one of her first real things.
Huh.
You could double check the dates, but I'm fairly certain. Yeah. So that's why this is same thing for Anna Kendrick. I think Anna Kendrick was signed on this before whatever her Twilight and then Pitch Perfect movies were. So it is a weird time that so many of these mostly minor to unknown actors and actresses were in this together and then exploded onto the scene. Because I want to say the biggest name people would have probably been Jason Schwartzman and Michael Cera.
Yeah.
And Schwartzman was bigger than Cera. So that's.
I'm trying to look now as you're talking. But I mean, yeah, it's you're probably right. But even like Satya Baba has been big on New Girl since this too. So I mean, like there's the timing may be a bit off here and there, but except for Sarah's, like you're right. Most of these are like right before they became huge. Most of this cast is right before they became huge.
And I can't remember if I'm fairly certain Brandon Ross Superman was after this or like right around it. It would have, Brandon Roth never really went anywhere, to the
Yeah.
best of my knowledge, even today,
Right.
because he's sort of an attractive, charismatic goof that doesn't, I think, play well for what people are looking for most parts.
Which is funny because he's very much not, I mean, I guess he is playing a charismatic goof, but he's not a good guy in this movie.
No,
So it's
no.
weird that he gets cast as good guys. It's like he shows that he can be a jerk.
I want everyone to know that Eddy just called all you vegans bad people.
No, only if you violate the vegan police's rules. Although, as we all know, the vegan police are institutionally corrupt and racist.
Since you've read the books, and before I make a joke about Brandon Roth, and I think one of the reasons they cast him in like an interview I read around Superman time was that his junk looked enormous in a Superman costume.
Probably.
I didn't say it. I read an interview. That was one of the reasons. God, that Superman move was so bad. It was so bad. Superman fought a mountain, and I forgot Kate Boswell, who they chose to be Lois Lane, was far too young and without gravitas to be Lois Lane. And then Superman was a stalker. All right, I won't talk about that Superman movie anymore. It's just bad.
Okay.
We're not going to cover that movie, by the way, Eddy. That's how bad.
Thank God.
Ugh. So it was just still fun to go back because I've seen Scott Pilgrim once. I saw it in the theater, and then I think I saw it once after that. It's been nearly a decade since I've seen it. It was fun to go back and rewatch it. For the in-house commentary I like to give, I was watching it last night, as I always do, right before we podcast, maybe like 8 ago. And Jill came in and was like, "What are you watching?" "I'm watching Scott Pilgrim for the podcast." And her thing was, "I'm sorry," and she turned and left the room. To give you our perspective on the movie, for those of you that have listened to our holiday special, there you go.
No, I'm with you. Like I saw it in a theater. Liked it. I saw it. I think maybe once on cable or streaming or something. A few years after that, I watched it again about a year ago because again that was when I reread the manga and I wanted to watch the movie. So this time, admittedly, I kind of watched it on fast forward because I just seen it recently enough that I knew all the major beats, but I still wanted to kind of watch it, specifically to kind of look at the visuals this time around. But I mean, I really like it, and it was interesting to watch it after The World's End because it's another example of a protagonist who's not a good person, frankly.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, though, since you've read all the books, how do you think it translated like a 120 movie for what 1,000, 200,000, 500 pages into this one movie?
Really well for a couple of reasons. One is because it was inspired by manga, it also kind of inherited manga pacing, which is a bit decompressed compared to American comics pacing. So not a lot happens in each book, and that's kind of the point of Scott Pilgrim. Because again, like this is set in Canada, and the idea is that this is a bunch of 20-year-old slackers who have nothing going on with their lives, and then things just they start off getting weird, but they just slowly, steadily get weirder, and it's always kind of that juxtaposition of super low stakes combined with really heightened action. But also, there were a lot of subplots cut out. There's a fair chunk of Ramona subplots sadly cut out. One of the criticisms I've had for the movie was that Ramona is just more of an object than a character. But that's because a lot of what made her a character in the comic did get cut out for the movie.
So it's like I said, I haven't read the comic, but it's interesting because from my perspective, with so little comic book knowledge, it makes her feel more mysterious going through the movie, as I don't have a lot of context for her character, other than that she is also not a good person, but has also gone through some unknown trauma.
Right, and I think the way the movie tries to reframe Ramona, it I don't want to say it entirely works because it still bugs me in ways. But you're right. The fact that she's supposed to be mysterious, kind of almost a femme fatale. Um, I think that's what the movie's going for, but I will say that, especially on rewatching it, um, she kind of lands at manic pixie dream girl, which is not a great trope.
Yeah, I can see that. Although would see her more femme fatale, how you're talking about, because in all of her relationships as we go through them, from the movie's context, what I can get is that she made them all bad people. Like
Right,
she
'cause she broke
essentially
up with
dumped
all of
them,
them.
broke them,
Mhm.
and essentially chains them all into these eviler versions of themselves.
Right. And that's I'm struggling here because I do like what the movie does, but I can't entirely walk away from the fact that where it lands is a very unfortunate feminist stereotype. But you're right in the sense that the way the movie kind of positions Ramona is that everybody else is basically, well, in Knives' case, literally, but everyone else is basically a kid. They're just trying to figure out how to be an adult, and Ramona's actually an adult, and so her being unknowable to Scott, who's our viewpoint character, actually makes sense because she is an adult and he is not, on a maturity level. So her strange adult ways, and on top of the fact that they frame it as, well, she's American and that's exotic, um, adds a level of ethereal weirdness to her. So her being kind of just a metaphor for, and you're right, like she floats into people's lives and then she leaves their lives and makes their lives worse as a result. She's also kind of a force of nature. So it's not, I can see why the decision was made to cut a lot of the material to make her less of a character and more of just a force of nature, as I said. But it doesn't excuse the fact that it still is a lot of uh, she comes in and uh, wrecks Scott's life, and Scott's entire motivation is to make the pretty girl like him, and she doesn't have very many conversations that don't involve around Scott. So it's I understand what happened there, and I understand how it got there, but it still puts it in an unfortunate place.
Did you know that this movie had other endings since O'Malley hadn't written the ending yet?
Oh no, I didn't know that.
So there. All right, I'll start with the one that they weren't going to do, but it was funny. Is that they were going to have Gideon turn into like a big, massive transformer,
Okay.
and they nixed that. The one that I found disturbing, because there was like two they really talked about, that I'm glad they did not do, is that it turns out Scott was actually kind of a serial killer, and
Oh geez.
all the video game stuff was just how he game sort of gamified everything, and
Whew.
he'd kill these kids.
Yeah, that would not have been good.
No. Mm-mm. And the other one that I think they actually shot and they tried to do was they had, okay, if we're going to spoil the ending, because I'm going to spoil the ending a little bit, they had Scott and Knives go off together,
Oh, okay.
and that didn't test well. Can you imagine
No,
why that wouldn't test well?
because she's still a fucking teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So we talked when we did the World's End that Gary is not a good person, but uh, uh, Gary is just kind of a jerk to his friends, and is kind of deluded. Um, Scott, the movie makes pains to make it clear that Scott has not had sex with an underage girl, but he is dating her. And the movie plays in that space for quite a while. Uh, um, now, n- the movie, interestingly, I don't want to get too much into it because we're talking about when we get there, but um, Scott is not just a jerk, he's actively damaging at times. and that can make him a hard character to like. We've talked before about how protagonists are not necessarily likable characters, but they are. You could be a protagonist not being a person that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this very much is part of that. Scott does get a character arc, but there's a lot of Scott frames his goodness through, again, being attracted to a pretty woman. The reason why all of this I kind of set to the side is that like I said, the movie takes very big pains to kind of say his relationship with Knives is bad. Nobody is happy
Yes.
with that. And on top of it, Scott actively damages Knives at one point. But I think the reason the movie is bad is because the movie never lets Scott get away with it, right? Um, the only time the movie lets up on Scott is when he starts acting like a decent human being. Not even good, just decent. So it's not the arc of, well, this person's bad, but we grow to like them and kind of forgive them for that. No, it's this person is not going to stop having their life be like shit that they have mostly self-created. They've both imposed a lot of this shit on themselves until he grows the fuck up. And once he does, then the movie finally goes, okay, now you can start actually having a win.
As a parent, I am forced to ask, so where the fuck are Knives' parents during this movie?
Where are anyone's parents in this movie?
So I'm just gonna say I would know who my kid is dating. Anyway, one of the things I mentioned during The World's End is that they did have Jackie Chan sort of fight production crew. Some of them come in and train all the actors and everything for about 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
So they're doing some of the moves themselves. There are stunt doubles and stuff, but you can see they actually learned how to do it, which was nice. And they had a similar beat for the people that were going to play all the music. They had someone come in and teach them how to play some basic music, so they looked like they were really playing.
Oh, good. I did notice that the people playing in bands actually seem to be like, particularly the guitar. I watch how people play guitar, and you could tell if someone is actually playing an instrument or not. But the guitars seem to actually be somewhat competent in playing guitar.
And supposedly Michael Cera already played the bass, and he had to play worse than normal so the other people could keep up with him.
That's funny.
Anything else you're going to talk about the backdrop of the movie before we get into, other than the movie itself? Total flop. Utter flop.
Really.
It made like maybe 50 million and it cost around 70 million to make. And that 50 million was worldwide.
Jeez, they didn't break even.
No. But the movie got a lot of good reviews. It's loved by critics, it's loved by fans, but not financially.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. Explain Scott Pilgrim versus the World in 2 sentences for the average person to go, I want to watch that movie. And it's hard.
Transmedia rom-com about self-discovery.
Okay, but that describes like 100 films.
Hey. With Michael Cera.
I mean,
there you go.
It's the point is like there's a lot of stuff, much like a lot of Wright's film talked about is like, they don't fit neatly into a box, or they fit neatly into 2 or 3 boxes at best. And so Hot Fuzz was Mr. Movie plus detective plus action film. World's End was middle-aged men trying to recapture their youth through nostalgia combined with alien invasion film. This is basically college age teenage romance meets superhero film, and it's the movie gets a lot of emphasis on its video game imagery, which is much more heightened than it is in the original comic. The original comic, they do explode into quarters, but there's not nearly as much. It's more, comic book framing for everything because it's a comic book. But really, the video game stuff is just another metaphor for the superhero stuff. because it's very
Interesting.
specifically fighting games that they're mostly homaging.
Because one of the things I did find out is that Edgar Wright actually wrote a letter to Nintendo to get them to let them use like all the sounds and everything from Legend of Zelda and everything,
Hmm.
because he reached out to them saying that like your games are something like, it was equivalent of like what, like the spirit of youth or whatever it was. And they're like, yeah, we like that. Here you go. Use all of our stuff.
Nice. But yeah, I mean, and for 2010, it it worked, right? Because like, this is an iconography, this is a mythology that the alleged target audience for this would really gravitate to, and I think did, frankly. Um,
A
but in a
sketchy
cult film
14-year-old
way.
memory. Sorry, go
Mhm.
ahead.
I was just saying in a cult film way, not in a made money way, as we talked, if we realized.
But like a sketchy 14-year-old memory, when it came out, I think I remember hearing that they did a lot of like Comic-Con and other public viewings of the movie.
Mhm.
So there were like rock star parties going on when they did it, but they also were showing the movie to their fan base
Mhm.
beforehand to get built hype for it. And then those fans didn't go to the theater to see it because they'd already seen it.
Say already seen it.
So that would probably add to it. Maybe not to the extent that it did, but yeah.
Right. But I mean, again, like, I mentioned this cast got together to do, the Netflix greenlit an anime for this. Um, in 2020, during the pandemic, they did a 10th anniversary read through of the script online. So the creative team really believed in this film. O'Malley still, like I said, is, and you said Wright was also involved in light adaptations. There was a video game spinoff of this
Yeah.
movie. So it definitely falls into the category of cult film in the sense that it a lot of people got it in a lot of ways, and I think, the video game stuff is a very obvious thing, but for frankly also just things like the fact that the characters are messy and the stuff they do are the kinds of stupid, horrible shit you do when you're in your early 20s. That's another reason why I kind of give, I don't want to say this movie a pass, but I mean, I sympathize with a lot of the movies doing this because I did stupid shit like this when I was younger. So it's like I can certainly see myself in some parts of this.
Yeah. Because you're trying to figure out who the fuck it is you want to be and how do you get there.
Right, and it's a lot of, sorry if I'm alienating any of our younger listeners, but a lot of people in their early 20s are assholes. They're still trying
A
to
lot of
figure shit
people in their
out.
30s are assholes.
Well, yeah, but
Um, so what I will say on a personal note is that having watched the Cornetto trilogy and now Scott Pilgrim, I sure as fuck would have liked to have seen some black people in these movies somewhere with
yeah,
some speaking roles doing something.
yeah.
And for this Scott Pilgrim, I can say with 90% confidence, because I watched it last night, that I didn't see one black person. And for most
Mhm.
of the Cornetto trilogy, I think I saw two people.
Yeah, yeah.
They didn't
No,
say
that
anything.
that is a big problem. And as now that I live here in London, there are plenty of black people in London. There is no reason why there should not be more of that. And there's plenty of black people in Toronto too.
I'm just saying. Anything else about the backdrop of the movie before we get into this 8-bit glory?
Nope, let's get into it. The amazing universal intro.
So we're kicking off the movie with some 8-bit glory, which there was also an 8-bit TV show for a while. So it was really like a trend. I don't know if it happened around the same time, though. I don't know if you remember
Maybe.
that one. It was on Comedy Central. It was like literally an 8-bit office worker TV show. They worked in office.
I
It was all
do
8-bit
vaguely recall that
graphics.
now that you say that, yeah.
I don't know if it's in. Then we shift from the 8-bit glory to a voiceover about Scott dating a high schooler, Knives Chow, and his friends giving him shit before she shows up. Then we get the little bio boxes for everyone. Steven Stills, the talent, Kim Pines, the drummer, and young Neil lives here. Kim shouts out their version of the Avengers, and then Sex Bomb kicks off the movie proper. We get the cool credit scenes going by. Post credits, we get that Knives is blown away by the band. And later when she leaves and goes home, Kim doubles down on Scott being a dick for dating a high schooler. I love this opening,
Minor,
Eddie.
yeah, no, the opening's great. A minor note is that The fonts they use for the pop-ups are the same fonts that O'Malley used for the comic, to the point where they made sure to purchase the fonts so that way they can get the exact same font. O'Malley gave them the font, but they actually purchased a license for the font to make sure they can legally use the exact same font for the thing. So, and all of the we don't see them yet, but the flashbacks that are animated are directly from the comic and drawn by O'Malley.
I actually heard, I don't know if this one's right or not, is that they weren't drawn by O'Malley, but in fact, it was Wright's brother did them in O'Malley's style. So I don't
Oh,
know
maybe the
if,
the the I did briefly compare one of the flashbacks to the comic, and it is beat for beat similar stuff. So, but someone else may have used those as storyboards. That's entirely possible.
because supposedly his brother does like a lot of that sort of artistic stuff for Wright. So I don't know. I read that somewhere, and I'm not saying I'm right. I just know that was one of the bits that jumped out at me. Because I
Right.
thought, like you, it all came from the comic, because why would you not use the comic from the person that's working with you to put on the screen?
Right. But unlike Watchmen, where I dinged it because it was too faithful to the comic, this is the right amount of faithful. Like the intro is structured a bit differently from the comic, to emphasize the fact that this is a movie. I think obviously the 8-bit Universal intro is different, whatnot. Um, but the order that they introduce Knives and the other characters in, they kind of jump ahead a bit and then backfill some of that stuff a bit later because it makes for a more engaging opening to meet the core cast as fast as possible. So this is to me the right amount of adaptation. Is extremely faithful, and if you've read the comic, you're going to see visual and notes and hear lines that you remember from the comic, but it is not a shot for shot recreation of the comic.
If you were in a band, we'll say a punk band, around 20 to 23ish, and one of your bandmates showed up and said he's dating a 17-year-old, what would be your response, Eddie? Let's put you on the
Pretty
spot.
much what this movie is, which is the "Are you fucking out of your minds?"
Okay.
And again, like what interesting about the movie is that Scott doesn't really give a defense, which is Scott's character. He doesn't like confrontation, and that's something that I find about this movie that I think gets lost as people watch it. Is that it is specifically Canadian, is made by a Canadian creator, um, and all of these characters are Canadian, and so that's we're not going into Canadian stereotypes here, but Scott is leaning onto one of those specific ones, which is that he doesn't like confrontation, and his refusal to confront people leads to a lot of the problems that he creates. And this is one of them. Is right at the beginning of the movie. It's like, what are you doing dating high school? It's like, that would be cool, I guess. And that's going to be an ongoing trend. So right out of the gate, we get the big problems that we're going to deal with here.
Based on, okay, from your talks about people's perception of Ramona for the film, what about their take on Kim? Because if Ramona is sort of our manic pixie dream girl / maybe femme fatale, Kim just is bitter X
Right.
throughout the whole film.
Uh,
With I don't see any real character progression for her.
Kim also has slightly more material. So to be clear, a lot of the material cut is Ramona and Kim. There's a subplot of
Okay.
Ramona and Kim fighting and then reconciling, which is largely absent from the movie. As I remember the comic, Kim is actually not nearly as bitter as she comes across in the movie. She is mad mostly because she still cares about Scott and Scott is fucking his life up, but not in the "you should be dating me" kind of way. There is a point where she relapses in the comic, but the way it's framed, it kind of comes across more as "I'll be better than any of your other options," not "I need you in my life." But because of the way it's cut down, you're right. She does come across as bitter X until at the end of the movie, she's suddenly fine with Ramona.
Okay. I was just curious, has anyone like really gotten in anything about that to some extent? I'm assuming not as much as Ramona, because Ramona would be considered to be like a co-lead in the movie.
Right. I mean, I think Kim doesn't engage with much just because she's more of a support character, but at least to a larger point of there are very few women in this movie that do not in some way talk about their relationship with a man. and one of them is literally censored at one point. So,
Oh god. Um, I love. All right, I said I love the opening. I do. I love the Batman style with like all the words popping out on the screen and everything else.
mhm.
It is. It is so good. Like I just kind of wanted to stop there and bask in that for a minute because some of my opinions may alter as we go through the rest of the movie. But like that bit hooked me as I had no context for the world, the books, or anything else before. That made me want to definitely engage the movie when I watched it the first time.
Yeah, no, so this movie gets a lot of credit for the very bombastic visual style. There's a lot of subtler visual stuff that I'll kind of touch on when we get there. But you're right. Like, this movie recognizes that in 2010, again, we're like within a year or two of this changing pretty significantly, but right in 2010, manga language was not quite as universally understood. So Wright correctly drew from different comic book language that would be much more culturally understood. And 60s Batman is a touchstone. Lots of people remember fondly the 60s Batman stuff. So it's a perfect example to kind of get into that.
Anything else before we move on?
Um, uh, I mentioned this before, but is worth emphasizing. Is like nobody in this movie is happy with Scott dating Knives. like literally nobody.
Well,
And
I know one person that is.
well, Scott.
No, no, not even Scott. Scott's not happy. Scott's dating
Well,
Knives.
true. That's true. Knives is happy that Scott is dating Knives.
Yes, Knives is happy right now that Scott's dating Knives. That's
No,
it.
you're right. Scott, and that's it. I forgot to mention that, but you're absolutely right. Scott's self-loathing kicks in pretty quick in this movie too. I think it's not right in the beginning, but pretty soon after this, his self-loathing kicks in pretty fast. So even you're right. Even
Yeah.
Scott's not happy he's dating Knives.
Wallace Wells, roommate, teases Scott as we get a breakdown of their apartment and how Wallace owns nearly everything in it except for like Scott's coat or and a ratty poster.
Mm.
He instantly texts everyone about Scott's 17-year-old girlfriend, and Stacy Pilgrim, younger sister, instantly calls him. Scott's previous girlfriend dumped him about a year ago, and he's with Knives because it's nice. Scott and Wallace wait outside her school the next day as Wallace warns her to run before the couple goes on a date. They play Ninja Revolution. They are totally in sync as we get a dating montage. It's very sweet and of the time of a 22-year-old with a teenager. Uh, we meet Julie Powers, has issues, at the record store. We learn Envy Adams was Scott's old girlfriend who stomped all over his heart before signing with a major record label company. And Scott lives across the street from his old house, which is fairly fascinating, but I'm not going to touch on that quite yet.
Mm.
Scott dreams about a woman on roller skates before waking up in bed with Wallace and other Scott, Wallace's boyfriend. The transitions!
Mm.
He sees his dream girl with Knives at the library and loses all sense of reality. Then at a party, he asks Comey, knows everyone, about his dream girl, Ramona Flowers, who's at the party. This one girl. Scott flounders at flirting with her and then stalks her all night until she leaves. We learn Scott dumped Kim and has a troubled, troubled dating history.
Absolutely true. Um, Sco, Wallace. I like the fact that Wallace is just presented as gay, and it's just it's not that's not commented on because the fact that he is gay is actually a pretty regular recurring beat, but he's not an object of fun. And
Yeah.
Wallace is in some ways just as prone to sleeping around as Scott seems to be, but because he's very open and honest about who he is and what he's doing, it comes across a whole lot better than Scott does.
Well, Wallace is the most grounded person in this entire movie.
He has a place to live. He's a decent guy, but letting Scott crash there. Yes, he's a bit of a gossip, uh, but like again, the very Wrightian gag of Scott's in bed, and then we see Wallace pop up, and he's in bed, and then other Scott pops up, and he's also in bed. Very kind of, you didn't realize you were able to sleep in bed until these moments happen. It's very Edgar Wright style of gag. But it's also I only have one bed, and so we're all going to sleep there. And eventually I'm going to kick you out because I want to have sex with my boyfriend. And that you just need to be okay with that because I'm letting you stay here.
And the thing is, though, that is a very college roommate style thing to happen.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Like hands down. So it's portrayed very well. But I'm saying Wallace is most grounded because of all those things you mentioned. And also at no point in time does Wallace, at least in the movie, ever blow his top at Scott. Everyone else does.
No.
He sort of explains it to him and then pushes him to do something. So he's trying to make Scott a more proactive person to pursue his life other than fucking crashing at his place.
Right. Again, yes, he's a gossip. He texts Scott's sister. That seems to be how he vents. But you're right. Wallace is just a decent guy. Yes, he cheats on his boyfriends at some point later in the movie. But of the cast,
we don't know that they're in a committed relationship, Eddie. We don't know that.
Okay, so minor spoilers. It's implied that he's cheating on his boyfriend, and then later on, it seems like his boyfriend and his new boyfriend are also together. So it's they're a couple basically. But again, the movie just because again, Wallace knows who he is, and most of the characters know who they are. And it's a Scott that's really lost, and so all the characters come from a place of kind of. I mean, they may not be completely in sync with who they are, but they generally know who they are. Scott then inadvertently challenges them. And Wallace is the only person who comes out of it unscathed. Wallace is the same Wallace at the end of the movie as at the beginning. Knives, on the other hand.
The fact that two men are waiting outside of a school for girl. All right, two young men, obviously not their kid in that school. Maybe a sibling? Maybe?
Yeah.
It's creepy as fuck.
Yeah. And what if you take the fact that Scott has been bragging about the fact he's dating a high schooler, that's the other thing, is that Scott at no point says, I am dating a girl named Knives. He always leads with, I am dating a high schooler, and that is somehow a desirable thing to have.
And everyone just not that. He frequently references that she's Chinese in all of his descriptions.
That's another thing. Yes. Yeah. You beat me where I was going. It's like,
sorry.
No. It's fine. It's fine. But we're on the same page, and that is that Scott's relationship with Knives is generally based around her identity and not who she is. She is a high schooler. She is a girl. She is Chinese. And all of those things are exotic, and therefore that is why he wants this relationship. And yet, when you get to the date, when they're on the same plateau playing Ninja Revolution, they could just be good friends. If Scott didn't put all of this weight of her identity onto their relationship, he could have just be friends with this girl and it'd probably be just fine because they have a lot in common. They get along well. They have similar tastes in music. They're both really good at the same video games. They could just be friends. But Scott is the one who's fucking this whole thing up.
I have to push back slightly on that because society, regardless of all right, so the dating part is just wrong on every level because there isn't enough for Knives to establish her own identity and so many other things associated with it. But even from a societal standpoint, if he's a 22-year-old dude just hanging out with a 17-year-old girl, there are societal assumptions about what's going on, and that is problematic in some senses.
Okay, fair. That's fair. Then maybe I should say in an idealized world, they could just be friends.
Yes, because it's and I swiftly point that out because they're not in a group of people playing video games or hanging out. It's the two of them constantly everywhere.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. And certainly, if you were Knives' father, and if a 20-year-old say, "Hey, we're gonna go play video games," you would be suspected the worst. So that's fair.
Yes.
And in Scott's case, you'd be correct.
I'd be like cruise. I would stalk them. I'd cruise by. I'd be like somewhere in my own sort of disguise costume, waiting with my baseball bat ready to intercede.
Right.
That's the dad in me. But we do learn about Envy Adams, which was a nice drop right here to have that show up. Already,
Mm-hmm.
we've established the name, potentially why Scott's dating her, and like his reasonings for it.
Mm-hmm. And also, yeah, because also that ties into the haircut gag here, right?
Yeah, that we get throughout the movie.
Because he got his
Um,
haircut once and it was bad, and they lost, and they broke up. So now he can never cut his hair again, or have someone cut his hair again.
I'm gonna mention it later, but I want to know from you for this Ramona bit when he dreams about Ramona, and she's going through like this spot in his mind. Is that in the book? Is that in the novels also? Okay. Given the nature of the movie, is that a real place or is that merely just a joke?
Um, the first time it happens, it seems like a joke, but at least in the comic, and I think the movie does this too. It's not quite as explicit. She literally can go through different dimensions.
I assume that with the door, but I was speaking more specifically about like Scott's mind.
Yes. Well, maybe it's not in the movie. Maybe it is only in the comic. Um, you're right. It isn't actually. The line isn't in the movie. In the comic, she says the reason why she's going through his mind is because she found Scott's mind is a shortcut.
No, she says that in the movie, but I'm trying to figure out if that was just a joke or not. But that gives me the
No, no,
context I
no,
needed.
no, no. Well, again, the way it's framed, it seems like it's a joke, but no, that okay. So the physics of the movie are hard to nail down because things literally happen that probably shouldn't happen. Because the video game language is not entirely a metaphor. Sometimes people explode into quarters, Um, so you have to take all of that with a certain amount of, is this a world where supernatural stuff happens, or is this all metaphor? That's the weird catch 22 of both of them, right? But the fact that she's able to go through people's minds as a shortcut is a plot point, and I think at one point they go through Kim's mind in the comic.
Okay. If she'd done anyone else in the movie, that would have clicked easier.
Right, right. So I think she does it more than to different people's heads.
Okay. Because one of the other things is I know that Wright said when he was figuring out how to do the movie, it was like he was taking a riff from some comic, I think from the 60s or a movie, but also from the style of musicals where people just break out in a song and everything else is just part of the world and it's somewhat ignored by people. So that works the fight scenes and other things. So it's a musical beat to it.
Right. Yes. We'll see a more explicit example of that a bit later. But that's one that dimension where the Wright's kind of bringing in other references here. Is that up to this point, it's more or less the comic. Like the Ramona going rollerblading through Scott's mind is very much framed like a dream sequence in the comic too, and it's framed as a dream sequence here. It's just the comic framing of a dream sequence versus the movie framing of it. They have different visual language for both of those, but they're both doing the same thing, which is that Scott is dreaming. He dreams of Ramona. Then he sees Ramona in real life. It's only later that she explicitly says, "I actually did literally rollerblade through your brain."
Ugh. Scott trying to pick up Ramona at the party is so bad. Like so bad. It
Yes.
hurt me physically.
But that leads to another interesting visual moment. Is you mentioned that this one girl, and it's put in block letters across the wall where we have Ramona framed on the right hand side. But then Scott goes up against the wall and he starts to obscure the words. So that's the first real sign we get that the heightened visual language we're seeing is in some way tangible to the characters. They're all existing in the same space. It's not a visual language slapped on top of the movie. This all blurs together on some level, and it gets blurrier and blurrier as we go along. But that's the first real moment where it's like Scott can interact with the metaphor, which is bizarre.
Ah, so genius. Anything else before we go on?
No, I think we can go on.
Everyone tells Scott to break up with Knives before going after Mona, and the next morning he gets an email about someone wanting to fight him soon. He orders an Amazon package to see if Ramona will deliver it, and we get another day, and the next day we get another dating montage, but this one shows him losing interest in Knives. Then he has a prescient dream about Ramona, who then tells him that she travels to the subspace highway in his head, and he convinces her to hang out with him by refusing to sign the package until she agrees. We learn she needed to escape, and we get a name drop of Gideon. That montage, Eddie, of the two of them on that date on the next day, even though they're
so
way too
awkward.
young, it hurt to see that.
It was. And the fake video game was a great way because using the Dance Dance Revolution language, every time you step wrong, it goes bad, 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 and it was nice using that to kind of externalize Scott's self-loathing at this point. But something that the movie does really well is that last episode I praised Wright for doing really good at showing that telling. With this movie, he's overtelling. Like the metaphor is constantly telling you what's really going on, so that the characters don't have to, because Scott is extremely bad at communicating his feelings. And so everything else in the movie has to explain what Scott's going through. And it's so over the head that it actually wraps around to being subtle again in a weird way. So like you have literally the video game telling you Scott is a bad person, bad, 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 fail, fail. And yet it doesn't feel heavy-handed. It's so bizarre.
Okay, having read the comics, when they cast Michael Cera, is that who you envisioned as Scott?
Not initially, but his manner. So Scott in the comic for me came across a little more likable. Um, he's whiny, but he was whiny in a kind of charismatic way. And Saris has a very different kind of charisma. Again, you talk about Arrested Development, and his character in Arrested Development is very much a whiny jerk. But there's something magnetic about him. You don't like him, but your eye keeps drifting back to him, as it were. And I think that's more kind of how it gets shaped here. But I think the fact that the rest of the cast are so fun and attractive and eye-catching that helps to kind of balance Scott out a bit more.
Okay.
And also, you don't have many scenes of Scott by himself. Scott is always with someone. So I think that also helps because you don't really have to sit with Scott alone. So there's always somebody else on screen that's a little less irritating, right?
Yeah. And the Ramona hangout, because it's not a date until it becomes a date with them out walking around. And that's when we get that door that they have to travel through out of in the middle of nowhere, which goes back to your point about her walking through dimensions, but how it ends on an almost sexy time between the two. Was I'm trying to remember the first time I saw it and how that was a semi unexpected shift to go from T to let's bond, shall we say, but then they don't bond.
Right. And that's actually right out of the comic. I double checked that because I'm like, this seems like arbitrarily sexy, but no, the comic also arbitrarily sexy. And to credit, Ramona does then quickly explain that she does these things fast. She falls hard. She feels like it's no point in wasting time. So this is very much Ramona is the initiator in this. She has all the agency in this situation. And it plays to, again, Scott's our viewpoint character, her strangeness of the fact that she is not acting in ways that he expects these things to go. As a side note, the Amazon gag. On the one hand, it is super weird to watch a movie where someone has to explain to another character what Amazon is. And so I was kind of curious. I have not watched the new anime, but I did look up a little bit about how it was made. And I was like, there's no way Netflix is going to authorize promoting Amazon on the show they funded. Turns out what they changed that bit because it's 2010. Ramona delivers Netflix DVDs. And I'm like, that's clever. I support that.
Oh, God. All right, that's good. I like that too.
That's all I
So
had for this chunk.
that reminded me, the movie feels sort of semi-timeless, but it's weird that Scott, as you said, was explaining Amazon, but at the same time, he kind of understood email and Wallace had a cell phone. So that was still a weird bit of thing right there to move the plot along.
I think so. I think what's happening here is that the technology is very 2010, but the clothing that people are wearing and a lot of the set design are very retro. And again, this is from the comics, like that wood paneled apartment. It's straight out of the comic book. In fact, even how the apartment's laid out is straight out of the comic book. So that heavy, thick shag carpeting, wood paneling, a big chunky TV set, that's all very 70s. And a lot of the thick necked shirts with the ribbing on the the two-tone colors of the shirts, that's all very 80s. Again, that's all kind of in the comic. Um, so I mean, I think the idea was to juxtapose the retro of the 8-bit video game noises and the retro of the clothing and the sets with the modern technology. I think it's why it gives that timeless thing. Some Batman the animated series pulls a similar conceit,
Yeah,
right?
it's exactly what I was
Uh,
thinking.
so I think that's why it feels timeless, even though it's very clearly dated in some very specific respects.
Ramona shows up at the Sex Bomb show, and that's where she meets Scott's sister, some of his friends, and his girlfriend, Knives. Before they can talk, Scott demands they go out and play. I do want to take a beat, though, to recognize the band that came out before Sex Bomb and their amazing hit song that was one word. And they're ready
Yep.
to leave before Wallace torments them, and we get a longer song about how they hate him. Oh, I love it. I love it so much.
It's
And
it's very shitty punk bar music.
and during their number, in the middle of it, Matthew Patel flies in, attacking Scott, breaking through the window. The first of the evil X's. The fight scene, I love it so much, Eddie. I love the fireballs. I love the demon hipster chicks.
Yep.
Demon hipster chicks.
Yep. They're also in the
If I
comic.
wasn't a married man, Eddie, I would want demon hipster chicks.
Give me your
One of the
band name.
points, I think my band would probably be like Clash of Demon Head. But one of the points about Ramona being a bad person comes up here, and we get some flashbacks to a comic. I don't know specifically which of them did it, but we get the backstory here is that the reason she dated Matthew because he was the only non-white, non-jock boy then, and it was only for like a week and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Go back reinforcing that she didn't date him because of who he was, but what he was. Sort of how Scott is the same way that Scott is dating Knives.
Right. And that's one of the things that is I like about both of these is that Ramona on some level is what Scott would be if Scott had more confidence, right? And on the flip side, the Scott could also be an evil X because the trend at this point is that it's probably gonna be a very short relationship. Scott's take it badly because he's never been the last thing I broken up with, he basically crushed him. Ramona will probably break up with him. That will probably also crush him and maybe turn him evil. So Scott is in this liminal space of he could be either of these things. And so you have that, and then you have a fight scene, right? And at no point is there any indication Scott is remotely good at fighting. And yet, the first thing Wallace says is fight him.
And okay, much how Frost is always Peg's backup in all these movies to give him the support he needs, Wallace is Scott's in this movie.
Yes, yes.
Because the first couple, there's Wallace saying, "Fight, Scott," and you get that repeated throughout.
Right. And of course, Wallace being Wallace, he's doing the support while also simultaneously trying to hit on somebody else's boyfriend.
Oh, I love it. Because you see that, all right, so you see Wallace and, God, I forgot her name now, the sister's boyfriend kissing, And she says,
Yep.
"Not again, Wallace," to show that this
Yes.
is a
Yes.
reoccurring beat for them.
Yes. Yes. And then so like, and the scene is fantastic because okay, so up this point in time, we've had some imagery, people role playing through Scott's head, whatnot, but it's been relatively light. In this scene, we have the band's visually acoustic attack early on. Then the Evil X shows up, literally drops through a ceiling, punches through a wall. We do have the video game inspired fight scene. Then we have the superhero style fight where everyone's flying through the air. And then after all of that, a Bollywood number.
Yep.
And it just, and the whole time, all the characters are just watching. It's like, this is a perfectly normal thing that happens every day.
And okay, so I didn't go and read because someone asked O'Malley, what happens to the X's when they turn to coins? Are they dead?
Mm-hmm.
And on his Tumblr, he said, no, they sort of respawn in their homes now, having learned a lesson and changed their lives, essentially. That's why they don't come back. But if that's true, then the people on the side, because I point out even our notes here, that the other band gets killed by those fireballs. They're evaporated. There are no coins.
Right.
There's nothing that's dead. So does
Right.
that mean that the main protagonists and antagonists continue to exist, and everyone else is just a NPC bystander with 2 hit points?
Well, and that's what's I really like about the film is this. Well, one thing I like about the film is that again, Scott's our viewpoint character. The reason why we don't know what happens to them is because they don't matter to Scott. They are literally the NPCs in his life. So if we're using his video game language to logical conclusion, they are not characters that get speaking lines relevant to him. So they have stopped. They've no longer served their purpose. They're no longer his antagonists for this scene. So they just get swept off stage. Their bodies disappear just like a video game.
And the coins, it's so beautiful, like in so many ways. Because while someone else asked a question for the Tumblr thing about what happens to them afterwards, but if you were having Scott kill people and their bodies left, then it becomes gruesome.
Right.
And it loses a video game feel, but having them turn to coins as a reward for the fight and experience removes that factor.
Right. And again, there's the idea of you can almost trick yourself into thinking that all of this, the Bollywood number, the video game language is all in Scott's head, maybe. But then he goes to pick up, goes, ooh, coins, and starts picking up the coins. So there's a physical, tangible components. So this stuff is objectively real in Scott Pilgrim's world.
And if someone was still thinking that it's just Scott that sees him, another point in the movie, someone else picks up coins too.
Yeah. So it's, I think I'm gonna save the analysis of the postmodernism for later when we do our wrap
Okay.
up. But suffice to say, we have talked before about how Wright is really good at blending genres, and this point he's just putting them into a fucking blender. He's like, I'm just going to throw everything in here. It's a video game. It's a Bollywood movie. It's Battle of the Bands. It's a teenage comedy. It's a drama. It's all going in.
We should try to email Wright to see if we get him to come on the podcast. He's blending genres. Awesome. We're genreless. Come on. He could just swing by. Scott defeats Patel and learns that he must defeat Ramona's remaining 6 evil exes in order to date Ramona, as Wallace steals Scott's sister's boyfriend. Wallace forces him to break up with Knives, who then blames Ramona and swears to win Scott back by becoming more like Ramona. We get more and more images of envy, and Scott blows off the band to have his second date with Ramona. After an awkward moment about his hair, they go for a walk, ending up at the film set of Lucas Lee, who Wallace has been stalking. We learn that Ramona's second evil ex, and he calls out Scott. We get another awesome fight scene. So one of the other things that I think I also saw is that a lot of the people have numbers associated with them too, kind of how they did for the World's End. Like Lucas Lee on his skateboard has like the double L's beside each other as seconds. The third one's going to have a 3 literally on his chest.
Yeah. That one I saw this time a little more clearly. Patel has Stripes level 1. Which, again, I forgot to mention this, but another small moment I love is that during the Patel scene, someone in the crowd makes fun of his outfit, and he yells back at them. So, like, the crowd is not only fully aware that Patel's there, but also are not impressed with his bullshit. It's just really funny.
That person was one of the writers or co-writers or something like that shouted out. So there are cameos sprinkled in this. Like Brian Lee O'Malley and his wife are in a very small scene somewhere in the movie too.
That's amazing. It's amazing. And then yeah, like but so like all of this is like all of the visual languages to framing Scott as this heroic protagonist, and then he's the whiniest piece of shit when Wallace is like, "You need to break up with Knives." Like, I don't wanna. And like this breakup with Knives is like the most limp dick bullshit I've ever fucking seen. He's ruthless to her.
I would challenge you that there is almost a weaker protagonist in their first movie. I don't want to go get the power converters. Just saying. Luke is a whiny bitch in Star Wars.
I mean, okay, fair. I'm not saying he's a whiny. Okay, maybe he's not the whiniest bitch ever, but certainly he's a petulant fuck, man.
100% agree. No argument at all. But that breakup scene is so bad. After she even says like the L word, it's
Yeah, and like again, like the visual language is really ramping up. Like she says, love. She leans forward, and goes love, and there's see love and puffy clouds flying towards him. And then like when he breaks up with her, like the background drops out and it's just black. It's so obvious. Not only is it specifically not as a comic book language, but as romance comic visual language now.
And not only that, he knocks the love away before it hits him. Like it's smoking the air. It's like, nope. Oh. And the Ramona date before they go out to meet Lucas Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Less than an hour to go through all those different beats of the thing. Eddie, yeah. I've heard of speed dating. I don't know what that was.
It was transdimensional dating. I don't know. It just feels fast. Yeah, because like we're still seeing Scott's on the bus and he's upset, and then we're intercut with images of Knives, and he just gets happier as he starts thinking about Ramona. And it's like, so he goes from despondent to happy in one bus ride. And I'm like, you are such a piece of shit.
I think it's a great fight scene because you get all the stunt doubles making it very Hollywood. And we get and he only beats Lucas because he challenges him to a skateboarding thing. Oh, and his ego wins out.
Yep. I have to say that when I first saw this, I didn't really know Scott Evans was. I didn't know many of these actors were, right? So now watching it again, I have a very different perspective. And so seeing one of the biggest movie stars in our generation playing a shitty movie star is fascinating. But also, I noticed this time around that there are Lucas Lee movie ads all through the movie up to this point. At one point in time, Wall Street newspaper, there's a Lucas Lee ad on the back of the paper. There's actually one point where right before the scene where Scott has a magazine and has Lucas Lee on the front, and he flips it over and there's another Lucas Lee ad on the back. Like when they're walking down the street at one point in time, there's a Lucas Lee movie ad in the back. So like they really amped up, and I think even character mentions Lucas Lee as a character or an actor at one point in time before Ronan comes in the scene. So they really build up Lucas Lee as this phenomenal movie star.
And they're actually spoofs on action movie posters too, is what they did too. So that was a nice touch.
Right. But the other bit that's aged really well is that right now in AEW wrestling, there's a wrestler named Darby Allin, who's one of the bigger wrestlers there. I mean, he's a very, very popular wrestler. He started off as a skateboarder, and so he works skateboards into his matches, and he sometimes skates to the ring. And so having a movie star who started off as a skateboarder resonates well with someone who's now a professional wrestler who's also a skateboarder.
Why am I getting flashes of Gleaming the Cube now? Huh.
Yeah, God, Gleaming the Cube. That's a movie we should talk about.
Jeez. Anything else about this part before we move on?
That other than the fact that and in fact that the skating challenge directly pulls visual imagery from Tony Hawk, the Tony Hawk franchise.
My knowledge of skating is too small for that. Ramona. Ramona.
Ramona? That's your other crush.
I'm not even going to say it. Never mind. Mary Elizabeth Winstead goes Scott and Wallace. And Wallace gives him a pep talk before telling him he'll need to move out. After a brief scuffle with Roxy Richter, Scott and Ramona min fences before he gets an invite to Envy and the Clash at Demon Heads gig, where Knives stalks Ramona, and she turns out Knives is now maybe dating young Neil. Tottingham is Envy's BFF and Ramona's third evil ex, who punches the highlight out of Knives' hair and states, "I'm not afraid to punch a girl." Scott calls him out, not so much for Knives, but because he insulted Toronto, but is easily stopped and overpowered by Todd, who is a superpowered vegan. He doesn't eat any meat, doesn't do dairy products, and it gives him godlike superpowers. And we get like an awesome battle of the bands snippet for this, and then just Brandon Roth Supermaning all over Scott.
So I always try to watch these in the spirit of when they were originally released. But it's super hard for me to get away from the fact that Captain Marvel is dating Superman.
Oh god. Since he has blonde hair, I would almost stick in the Marvel universe and call him the Sentry.
You know what? I'm totally fine with that too.
And I would stick with the Sentry because Scott has to trick him again to beat him. But when the vegan police come and depower him, he basically goes from Sentry to Bob.
And one of the vegan police is the guy who played the Punisher.
Marvel people all over this fucking movie.
Yeah. It's so you have the Punisher shooting Superman because he was taking Captain Marvel.
Oh, it is unbelievable. And all right, I'm going to say a little bit here, but Doctor Strange could have learned about music battles from Scott Pilgrim. A little bit in this scene, more later.
Okay.
Did you see the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness?
I did, but honestly, I've forgotten most of it. The movie did not stick with me.
Is a music battle with evil version of himself, where they throw like little musical notes at each other. They throw them more like darts. This is what it should have been like.
Right. I also love, so one thing I've learned is that Brie Larson is really funny, and they should be using that more. Because I love the gag of her, the way she stands on the movie poster, and then it turns out she's standing in front of the movie poster in exactly the same pose. Fantastic.
Oh, so many good things.
Anything else? Honestly, like, she looks like a rock star, right? I mean, did a really good job with her. Her look is fantastic. And then is this where they play? Is this where they play the music? Is if they had their song?
Which song?
No.
Envy's
band hasn't played
here.
Their music yet, huh?
No, Envy's band plays here.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That song is good, right? Like that.
Yeah.
I love that song. As soon as I like it completely blanked on my memory, and like the first few beats, I'm like, oh, I remember this song. I remember really loving this song. Hello, my friend. And I was just like, oh, this is great. And it's such a nice balance because like all the other music up this point has been really decently performed, but very kind of garage punky.
Yeah.
Thing. And then you have a proper rock band playing a proper rock song. And it just shows you that they are leagues above all the other bands here. It helps, like, they're just, again, Brie Larson looks like a fucking rock star, and I completely believed it.
Wow. That was a great outfit Brie Larson was wearing. I'm not going into that, though. We're not here to talk about that. Scott grows frustrated during the process, and after an outburst regarding Ramona's dating history, I keep wanting to say Ramona now, she confronts him about dating Knives and Kim. Then Roxy Richter strikes, another evil ex. Ramona, God, I keep wanting to say Ramona, intervenes, stopping her from attacking Scott. And they pull out weapons like they're fucking Highlanders. Out of nowhere, here's my enormous ass fucking ex. Here's my chain weapon that I got from, I forgot the name of that video game. It was a fighting game. And Gideon's name keeps getting dropped repeatedly. Roxy breaks out some rules that says she can only be defeated by Scott's own fist. But unlike Todd, he can't hit a girl. So Ramona pilots him for the rest of the battle, and they defeat Roxy by giving her the big O. And then Ramona breaks up with Scott because he makes an ass of himself afterwards after he's drinking.
Right. So on the one hand, recognizing it's of its time, having a queer woman being used as an object of fun is a little frustrating to me. But on the other hand, it is genuinely funny when she's like, "I'm bi-furious."
Oh, it was such a great line. That's what I'm torn about this movie. It does the beats, but at the same time, I think if Wallace wasn't there, I wouldn't be able to laugh and enjoy the movie.
Right, because she's not the only example of queer representation, right? So
Yes.
that's why I think it gets a pass. Also, I noticed this time I was like, "Oh, look, I've called this out several times. Only women can attack women in movies." But then Wright actually sends that up by, okay, Scott's like, "I can't hit a woman," and so Ramona uses him to fight, and it's like, this is, do you realize how dumb it is that only women attack women in these movies? It does help that having Knives having the highlights punched out of her hair earlier on establishes that that's not a rule we're going to be following in this movie. But it was nice. Like, this is a trope. The girl on girl fight is a trope. And a bit like Hot Fuzz, they diffused that by making it into a sexual gag. This is the make a gag that Scott is such a whiny, ineffectual asshole that literally his girlfriend has to do the fight for him.
Oh, and I think it shows up here, but you notice that Scott puts the Coke Zero in his head, and he wears a shirt for Zero. So there are constant reinforcers that Scott isn't an evil X yet, how you talked about, but how he could be, and he has his own number. So that was a nice touch that's just sort of subtly laid throughout the entire film if you're not looking for it.
Right. And also reinforces that Scott is our viewpoint character, but at this point, again, a bit like we had with The World's End, is Scott actually the protagonist? Maybe Ramona's the protagonist. It turns out that's not the case.
You say Ramona or Ramona?
I said Ramona. I said Ramona. And that's really interesting because I'm going to spoil the big twist that happens in the very first episode of the anime series. But Scott's actually not in the anime series. He dies in the fight against Patel. So Ramona is the protagonist in that series. So
I wonder
here we
if that's
see,
why I didn't get a second season.
Yeah, because they basically go through the whole beats of the original the original comic. But what would happen if Scott actually died? So I think they had plans for it, but it would have been beyond Gideon. What happens at that point? But knowing that and then watching this, you start to see glimmers of. I've already things moved pretty heavily for how remote a lot of stuff Ramona's come out and how it's framed, but you see bits of that remaining material here, and here's one of them where Ramona has agency. Like frustrations aside, she has complete agency through this entire movie. The reason why Scott has to fight the evil X's is because the evil X's are going to come after him, not because she's mandated this. And she's just as annoyed and frustrated by this bullshit as everybody else is. But but like she just defeat them so we can get on with this, right? And because obviously the fighting the evil X is a metaphor for coming to terms with your partner's history and blah blah blah. So here we see that Ramona is an extremely capable character. She is not defined by Scott. Scott keeps kind of shoving her into this box, and she keeps breaking out of it. And this is one example that where like she literally takes control of the narrative for this scene. Scott is nothing. Scott is the object to be fought over in a way, and she takes control of the whole narrative for a moment when he just refuses to be the protagonist. He just opts out of being the protagonist at this part of the movie, and Ramon's like, "Fine, I guess I'll be the goddamn protagonist." So it's fascinating because it's so many layers this movie is playing with, and they're so fast. And like I didn't catch this shit the first 2 or 3 times I saw this movie. It's only sitting and carefully analyzing it and catching some of this stuff.
So I guess I'm now having real problems. I understand the visual aesthetic of Romantic Pixie Dream Girl for Ramona. From like her constant hair color changings, the fact that Mary Elizabeth Winstead is super hot, but hearing her take control of the narrative, the fact that she doesn't want these things to happen and she is an active part of it, how does that completely layer on top of her as a character?
And that's the problem, is that she has moments like this where you can see glimmers underneath of it, but she's ultimately subsumed by her archetype, which is the manic pixie dream girl who validates a man's life, and helps him find joy, and usually through that romantic satisfaction. So I like this stuff, but I know where the ending is, and where that goes, and it doesn't. And so she ultimately succumbs to Scott's story.
See, I'm still torn, but it's more to the ending. But we'll get. I'll talk about when we get there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, let's save that before we get there.
Sex Bomb versus the twins at the Battle of the Bands, and Ramona is there. Kim tries to convince Scott to go talk to her before it's too late, but Amp versus Amp kicks off. Doctor Strange should be taking fucking notes. This is how you do a music battle. Doctor Strange is a fucking sorcerer supreme with ultimate magic. You don't throw notes like they're fucking darts in your D&D game. At the next Battle of the Bands, Sex Bomb defeats Ramona's 5th and 6th Alexis, earning Scott an extra life, which is pretty funny when it pops onto the screen. He finds Knives secretly watching the show before literally just walking away from her to go after Ramona, but she's back with her 7th and final Alex Gadian, who offers Sex Bomb a 3-record deal. They all accept it, except for Scott, who quits, and young Neil signs up to join the band in his place.
I like this battle because technically this is really Sex Bomb versus the twins. Scott's not... Between the last scene and this scene, Scott's becoming less and less central to the narrative, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't even really want... He's debating leaving the Battle of the Bands. He argues that maybe we should just quit or whatever. And Sex Bomb's like, no, this is important to us. And so all of the interests and goals of the secondary characters are starting to overrun Scott. And the reason why I like this movie is because Scott stopped being a viable protagonist last scene, and he's not really coming back up. He's the center of this because the twins are going after him. But if he wasn't there, this would be a very different scene. But it doesn't. But Sex Bomb's goals are identical. We want to win this conflict. This conflict happens to overlap with your fight with 2 exes. But we would want this victory either way. And then also Knives secretly stalking. I have to give credit. A lesser creative team would have turned her into an explicit ninja at some point. That would have been such an easy step to take at any point in this narrative, given the fact that she is Asian. And they don't. They walk right up to that line. She uses knives, she's stealthy, but they never quite... For all of the bombastic, heavy-handed imagery that this movie uses, that's not one it uses. So I have to give credit for that.
I think our actual ninja, if there is one in the movie, is Roxy Richter.
Yeah.
Who literally vanishes in puffs of smokes and everything else that media associates with being a ninja.
Oh, one thing I want to say, since you mentioned Roxy, one of the running gags of the comic that I appreciate, the comic was written in black and white. And Ramona's changing hair color was a running joke because we, as the reader, could not see it. And so at one point in time, Wallace gets so frustrated with her, it says, I don't even know what color your hair is supposed to be. So then they colorize the comic. And she has explicit hair colors, which match with the movie.
Yeah.
And so there's actually a box in that panel that says, this joke was funnier in the black and white version. which brings me to the movie, is that some of the jokes are explicitly rewritten to work better as a movie joke.
Yeah.
And the Battle of the Bands is one of them, because there's a very visual style you could do with comics you can't quite do with the movie. And so by them using the waves of sound, like you said, it's a better way of visualizing that battle that Doctor Strange made a little too explicitly physical. This is right on the balance of, it's still an auditory conflict, but they use the waves of energy and then the crushing of the equipment to make that look better. And I think that brings a more physicality to it that didn't quite work. It wouldn't work the same way in the comic book. So I appreciate that they took the time to rewrite these jokes to make sense for the medium they were in. Again, this is a really good adaptation.
It's good to know. Anything else before we move on?
No, let's move on to the next bit.
We get a sad montage of Scott being lonely and all by himself before Stacy swings him on a swing set and basically drags him even more for some of his shitty life choices. Back at the apartment, Wallace dumps on him some more. And then Gideon calls inviting Scott to the venue at Chaos Theater, where Wallace says, "Forget everything I said, go kick his ass." And when Scott shows up, through a great montage of Scott suiting up to go have the fight, walking through the different security gates. Beautiful. It like undercuts itself, builds up, undercuts itself, and then literally he goes down 7 levels. And when in the club, there is Six Bomb obediently playing as a house band. Total costume changes, and they feel Starbucksed. Resolving to win Ramona back, Scott challenges Gideon to a fight for her affection, earning the Power of Love sword. He defeats 7 goons, but Gideon beats him in one move. He is saved only by Knives, who then attacks Ramona for breaking Scott's heart. Scott is forced to reveal that he cheated on both of them, and then Gideon stabs him through the heart, killing Scott. Ramona visits him in limbo to reveal that Gideon has implanted her with a mind control device. She apologizes to Scott and lets him know that maybe she wasn't who he should be fighting for. Scott uses his 1-up to come back to life, having learned something.
Yeah. So, obviously, with the fight scene is a big thing to talk about. But right before that, you mentioned the building up and undercutting. My favorite bit of that is they frame the whole thing like it's going to be, he's gearing up, he's going to do the fight scene. What's the password? Whatever. All right, you go in. And like, okay, that's funny. But then they go to the next set of guards. There's 2 guards there. What's the password? And literally, Scott says, they let him go. And it's like, it is so obviously this is here for a joke moment. And it works perfectly because the tension's being ramped up. And it helps that, like, also Wallace has been dumping on him so bad. So Scott is kind of doesn't want to do this, right? Like I said before, he's pretty much opted out of being the protagonist, and Wallace has tried to browbeat him into taking control of his own story again. And eventually that works, but Scott's still kind of reluctant to be here, which is fascinating, and that leads into the power of love thing, because in retrospect, not only is that the obvious where the audience stories goes, but it's also where Scott thinks he should be doing. It's this is what I guess what I'm supposed to do in this moment, and it's the wrong choice.
I know, and it's brilliant. I do want to take one step back to go that when he comes in, and before the music kicks up, we get Kim. Kim for me is the MVP in this movie. With the we're Sex with Bomb and we're here to sell out and make money and stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, because it establishes their entire context for the band and the journey they've been going on to reach this success point that Steven wanted for them. To then get Scott to go up to try to be a protagonist and hero and to fail, but admitting what he did to both Ramona and Knives.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Kim. I suddenly started thinking, is Kim the Greek chorus of this movie?
Yes.
Because every time Kim speaks, she's speaking for the mood of the world against Scott. So when Kim is mad at Scott, Scott is fucking up. When Kim respects Scott, Scott is doing good.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. That's cool.
Anything else about? Do you want to take a beat to talk about the mind control device that Gideon implanted into her?
So the first time I saw this movie, I was like, "What the fuck?" Right? I'm like, "Where the hell is it coming from?" I realize now that this is the shonen manga slash video game stuff ramped to 11. Right? Where we're at is we are in Metal Gear Solid territory of the plot makes no goddamn sense anymore, but that doesn't matter. The plot is just there to get us to the next fight scene. So I don't know. You're dead, and your girlfriend has a mind control device, and Gideon has your band control. The idea is that the stakes are so insanely ramped up that it is implausible that the protagonist could possibly get out of it, and then somehow does. Again, I mentioned Metal Gear Solid because Kojima does this great, where it's like, and great in quotation marks. It's the here's the stakes ramping up, and what if they just added like 5 more things on top of that? And it's like, that's enough. You have enough stakes. Put some stakes back, Kojima. No. What if it's a nuclear bomb, but also a giant robot that has nuclear bombs strapped to it? And also, what if it's shaped like a bear? And what if you're in a sniper battle with a woman who's shooting you while she's on top of the robot that is also a nuclear bomb? And it's just like, God damn it, calm down, buddy.
Oh god. And
so now it's like the mind control device, it's like, sure, whatever.
in the fact that it's Ramona there to tell Scott that he shouldn't be fighting for her, but should be fighting for himself. And at that age, and even throughout life in general, it is, you need someone to tell you these things just bluntly, sometimes for them to make any sense to you. But that's after having gone through multiple trials of doing things before it really sinks in.
Right. And that's another really good point in the sense that at this age, speaking as nearly 50-year-old men telling the kids how to live their lives, you should be making mistakes, right? You're still figuring out who you are. Scott, that's the point of the movie. Scott doesn't know who he is yet. And so you should be able to fail and learn from those mistakes to figure out who you really are. One thing that people have criticized the movie for, and I didn't for a long time have a rebuttal for, is that literally everyone tells Scott what to do in this movie. Well, everyone tells Scott when he does. He refuses to do it and then ultimately does it, and he is rewarded for doing the things everyone told him to do. But you bring up a good point. At that age, you're right. Your friends should be telling you when you're fucking up, and then you should be listening to them. So from that perspective, Wallace dumping on him and then saying, "For everything I said, go get him," is Wallace being a good friend. Wallace saying, "Here's where you screwed up. Now go fix it." And Wallace actually does that 2 or 3 times in the movie.
And the thing is, they're not telling him how to fix it.
No, they're telling him to do it, but not how to. Right.
And that's the important thing.
Right. And so if you come from this movie, the perspective is that the protagonist should have enough interiority to make decisions, then yes, Scott Pilgrim is a very frustrating experience. If you come from the perspective that the protagonist is simply the person who's the person who motivates the plot, Scott absolutely is the protagonist, with a brief exception in the middle, where the film metaphysically actually briefly collapses in narrative because the rest of the supporting cast has to actually take over as protagonist to get Scott back into the protagonist role. But the more and more I watch this, the more and more I think about it, the more and more I think that's intentional and a metaphor for sometimes we lose control of our lives, and our friends need to be the ones to kind of help pick us up and maybe not point us in the right direction, but at least give us a map.
Yeah.
And say, maybe look this way, you know?
And a lot of that goes back to something I think I've been saying now for months, maybe like a couple of years, whenever we get to it in a certain movie or TV show like this. It's about the community that they have, and being a part of that is so essential. And this is a representation of that. And pretty much all of the Wright movies that we've talked about are in some sense. Anything else before we move on to the last part of it?
Let's finish it up.
Using his 1-up life, we restart the level. Then we get a full remix. But as Scott hits the club this time, he's level 7. Scott re-enters the Chaos Theory, punching out the security guards. He goes down the 7 levels. He makes peace with his friends and challenges Gideon, this time for himself, gaining the Power of Self-Respect sword. After apologizing to Ramona and Knives for cheating on them and accepting his own faults, Scott joins forces with Knives, and the pair defeat Gideon with a little bit of action from Ramona to help them in a moment of need. And then we get Nega Scott. Now free from his control, Ramona prepares to leave. Knives accepts that her relationship with Scott is over, and she encourages him to go after Ramona to try again. And the duo leave through the star door into an unknown future.
Yep. And this is, for me, what validates it, because Scott genuinely goes on a character arc, right? It's the you watch a movie with an unlikable protagonist because you want that protagonist to redeem themselves on some level. That's a reductive statement, but for me, that's how these things need to work. And this does work. Is that and the whole movie has been pointing towards, here are the romance tropes you're expecting, and now we're going to shatter those. So having him again, like, he fights with Knives, and they have the same kind of fluid synergy they did when they were playing the video game. Scott genuinely apologizing to his friends, the 2 women that he hurts, and even to a degree to himself, is important and meaningful. It's rushed, sure. But that's not the movie we're talking about here. It's not meant to be a deeply dramatic moment. It's meant to be a heightened manga/video game moment where, he just does the thing. But because we're framing this in this very heavy video game influenced structure, for me, it all flows, because it's of course, we externalize the self-respect as a literal sword, and he fights somebody with it. Of course, that's what this movie is at this point, it's this movie. You're right. If it had been one of the other endings we talked about, I would probably hate this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But this movie does a lot to pull out the nosedive. Not perfect. It definitely has a lot of problems, but this ending, I genuinely could not see a different ending, because no any other ending would be just would leave too many questions unanswered.
Absolutely. Is that your final wrap up for the movie?
I have other thoughts, but I'll let you get to your thoughts too about the ending.
So I liked it. And part of it for me, why I find it hard for Ramona to be just like the manic pixie dream girl that I'm hearing is like associated with the character. I visually see it, but I don't see it from the actions and the plot beats that are making specific space for her not to be that. And it's even sort of reinforced here once we get rid of like the mind control chip and everything else. She comes in and tries to help the 2 of them. But the movie isn't about her. It's about resolving the conflict with Knives. And that is the key crux of that final fight. The 2 of them in unison together, how they were at the start of the movie in that bad relationship, to here, and then Knives telling Scott to go do something else, showing that she's matured and progressed past where he is, and is kind of the actual character of the movie.
Right. I can see that. I think now that we've talked it through, agency is kind of the big issue here, is that Ramona has all of the agency until Gideon literally puts a brain implant in her.
Yes.
And the brain implant is this kind of movie's language metaphor for Ramona no longer having agency. And she is not, even though Scott believes she is an object to be won, at the end, she is not won, because Scott literally defeats it by self-respect, not for love.
Mm-hmm.
He defeats Gideon for himself, not for her, and she chooses to go with him after he makes that choice. So and I've talked it out. I think that helps me to alleviate some of it. But the other thing I want to mention is that this leads into the postmodernism of the movie itself. I'm going to get super fucking art theory here because this movie needs it.
That's what people show up for.
Right. Postmodernism is the idea that you can no longer trust the view of the world that you're presented. It juxtaposes things that should not normally be in conjunction with each other, and new meaning evolves from that. So this movie is explicitly postmodern because, as we've said before, people literally explode into quarters, and that is not a metaphor. That is something that actually happens in the movie. So you have to take it as read. This is a postmodern movie. So the balance of these ludicrous, nonsensical moments that have their own internal logic, i.e., the logic of video games, balanced with the emotional journeys that some of these characters have gone on, means that you kind of have to maybe question the tropes that you would saddle them with, right? Like I said, Ramona isn't quite the femme fatale. She isn't quite the manic pixie dream girl. Knives starts off as the jilted lover, but breaks out of that and becomes the powerful sidekick. If anything, she is the shonen equivalent of the rival who you hate that you then come to respect and eventually become best allies with. So I mean, there's another kind of manga influence there. So for me, I could totally see a lot of people looking at this movie and going, Scott's an asshole, don't care. He's horrible to women, don't want to watch this movie. I could totally see that being a thing. And it's a valid read, like what you like. But for me, I struggled for a long time to figure out why I liked Scott Pilgrim, because everything on a surface level is not a movie I should like. I'm not big into teen romances. I'm not into edgy protagonists. I'm certainly not into a guy dating a teenager. All this stuff seems like it's really bad. Why am I rooting for Scott? And I think the answer is because all of the fight scenes and metaphors and evil X's are really just examining the fact that people's relationships are messy. There are very few romantic stories I can think of where the past dating histories of the two leads are a significant and major plot point. And we take it from that perspective, then of course we're going to externalize Scott fighting through his anxiety about his girlfriend's past relationships as literal superhero fight scenes. The fact that Knives is 17, we as the audience have to be against Scott and Knives from the get-go, and that is a very easy way to do that. To say, Absolutely. This is bad, you should not do that, without making Knives a terrible character. So we get sympathetic for Knives while still saying that Scott should not be in this relationship. That is a very efficient way to do that. So while it's uncomfortable, the more I think about it, the more I think that is an intentional choice. So, yeah, at the end of the day, I've always liked this movie, but I've struggled until we recorded this to really articulate why. And the answer it comes down to is that there's O'Malley and Wright really thought about a lot of things. Clearly, the ending was a bit of a rough job for them, but
because it wasn't written yet,
right? But they knew these characters really well, and they knew exactly what this world needed to look like. So I'm completely with you in the sense that there's it's easy to kind of, and I even did criticize it early on. It's easy to criticize that, but when you start thinking it through and really analyzing it, it's much deeper than it first appears, and there's a lot of texture there, which is why I've been meaning to go back and watch the anime, because I'm really curious to see what happens when it's basically Garfield without Garfield. What is Scott Pilgrim without Scott Pilgrim? What does that look like? And I'll be really curious to see what that ends up looking like when I go watch it.
And for me, I've liked this movie since I first saw it, but I think I kind of always knew is that they managed to strike a balance. And that balance is what we discuss when we touch on how both Ramona and Scott's relationship kind of mirror each other in some of the things that they do. It also takes in Wallace's relationships and how he is there potentially with infidelity, maybe not with infidelity, we're not really sure. But it shows a messiness of all sorts of different relationships. And then we get, the same time, it shows Knives' progression as primarily the only really good person throughout the movie. And it shows like some of the rough patches of her life. But at the same time, most of us are listening have been where Scott and all these people are. And so it's an instant keystone to establish an understanding and a sympathy for them and seeing parts of it that mirror your own life. And that's hard to do. And it does it well. And so I will take all of Eddy's great theory stuff and just craft on. It's balanced and it speaks to people.
That's a really succinct way to summarize my long babble.
but people come for your babble. They don't come for my succinctness. They go, man, Chris is done in 3 words, and he takes like 4 minutes, and they want the 4 minutes,
or they want the 3 words. Shut up, just get to the end.
So we've wrapped up our Wright run. Any final thoughts on Wright? Because it became a Wright run when we didn't have Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in this, or Jessica Hine.
Yeah. As usual, I'm always glad for these kind of digressions, and there wasn't quite enough here for a full season, so this was the perfect way to kind of approach it. I have certainly gained appreciation of absolutely everything we've talked about. Stuff that I know I loved before, I love even more, and stuff I've never looked at or didn't think much of, I've gotten much better respect for, particularly Spaced. I really did not like Spaced, and I've come around to it pretty hard. So yeah, I'm really glad we did this.
So am I. I knew I've liked them all, but it's been almost everything that we do is more fun when I get to watch it than I get to talk about it with you, because you bring out a lot of things that I may have thought about or may not even considered. And then we get to like have a little discussion about them. It makes me think about it in more depth and detail for whatever it was. So always fun.
Yeah.
Eddy, what can people expect from us next time we do this crazy show?
So we're going to go back to Sword and Sorcery finally, eventually, after we had 6 weeks away, because we also had the Christmas episode in there.
Huzzah!
Huzzah! So we almost did a historical Christmas, so we almost slid back in, but we managed. So we're going to go to the Wheel of Time, which I have not seen, but taking leave from Chris, I'm going to stick to the first season and start with the pilot episode, because last time I screwed it up. So we're going to do Season 1, Episode 1, Leave Taking, Season 1, Episode 2, Shadows Waiting, and Season 1, Episode 4, The Dragon Reborn.
Eddy, if people wanted to buy your sweet, sweet swag or get in touch with you or come have a pint with you, where could they do these things?
Well, if you have a pint with me, you have to move over to the UK and go to North London, and we have to settle on a separate place so we can meet up there and figure out how we're going to divide the cost, who's going to buy what round. This is the whole process. So much easier if you go to my website, realmsofpugmire.com, where if you buy some of the Realms of Pugmire stuff, I do get a cut of that. Just released a second edition of Realms of Pugmire, so now's a great time to get on the ground floor of the new edition of the game. But if you want to just chat with me, you can also find me on the Darker Hue Discord, where I am frequently posting random shit I find on the internet. How about you?
If you're looking to support me, you can go to darkerstudios.com. You've probably already missed the great sale that I had for not checking my website or social media frequently enough. So I'm going to shame you into going and buying Haunted West. If you want to talk to me about these things, you can come to the Dark Hue Discord, where I am posting a bunch of memes and occasionally songs of the day.
Indeed. So with all that, we will see you next week with the Wheel of Time.